Welcome to Beatles Stuffology. We're two old friends sit around and talk BS, Beatles stuff, on a track-by-track basis, pretty much for the sake of it. My name is JG McQuarrie, and I'm here with my co-host, Andrew Deacon. Say hi, Andrew.
Hello.
Hello, how are you doing this week?
I'm doing really good. I'm a happy bunny because we're going to talk about a song that, whilst not being a top drawer Beatles song, is I think one of the first instances where you'd say that you've got a bit of a standard, and obviously Lennon and McCartney wrote lots of things. Well, I suppose even if you include Harrison as well, with something and Here Comes the Sun, they've got loads of songs in their catalogue that are classic standards. And when we get into And I Love Her, and especially start talking about the range of people who've covered it, we'll sort of then start to see that we've got something here that is more than just the sum of its parts.
Yeah, I think that's probably a very fair description of it. It's one of those songs where it's sort of inescapable to a certain extent. I mean,
Yeah.
you don't describe it as a top drawer, but I think in some ways, I mean, if simply by the number of other people who have got their grubby little protuberances on it, I think it kind of is. It's a
Yeah.
really well covered song, and there's very good reason for this, and
Yeah.
it's kind of lovely to reach this point where we get where we get to talk about it really.
Yeah, and you get it's quite interesting because both Lennon and McCartney are having their first proper go at writing those sort of ballads on this. So we've seen a step up with Lennon's version a couple of episodes ago, and now we've got this, and you just think actually there's something that's a little bit more refined about this. It's as good as Lennon's song was, this one is just that little bit classier. So, If I Fell, great. By the way, like the title, If I Fell, we're sort of almost asking it in a conditional sense. But here, And I Love Her, there's something that's even quite clever about the title that gives you that bit of information. So it's quite a simple thing, but done really, really well. And that's what I have to say. This song is. It's a simple thing, but it is done incredibly well. So kudos, Beatles. I'm sure they'll be very, very happy to know that I feel quite positively about it.
I'm sure they will be, and you are right to feel positive about it. I would also posit it's definitely a song which draws its strength from its simplicity, and that's not true of every simple song, as I think we found out last episode. But it's such a lovely piece, and I think if I was choosing a word to describe it, which is exactly what I'm going to do, I think sophisticated is the word I would probably go
Yeah.
for. I think this comes across as really sophisticated in a way that I think a lot of the earlier material doesn't, or at least let me say the material that we've covered up to this point. There will be another whacking great example in this album a little bit later on as well. But there's a sophistication to the writing here, and the imagery isn't really complicated. It isn't really a question of having a bottomless thesaurus to pull endless words out of the English language. It's a very, very simple song, but it is done pretty much to perfection. And that edge of sophistication, I think it's the same thing that certain songs like maybe Till There Was You was maybe aiming for, that kind of thing,
Yeah.
but just it doesn't hit the same kind of level that this song does. Everything about this song comes together just beautifully. It's,
But
it's
remember,
simply lovely.
of course, as you know, Till There Was You was a cover.
Oh yeah, of
So,
course, but I
so,
think it's I
so
think it's still
therefore,
aiming for that air of
yeah,
sophistication.
you
Yeah,
can see that influence in this. And by the way, I like the idea of a bottomless thesaurus, and I'm pretty sure that the Germans have a word for that.
yeah. Well, because well, English vocabulary is to language what Chinese population is to people.
Yeah. Now, can we before we sort of dive into this, I have to get something out of the way. And we're going to come back and talk about the sequence in the film, but there's one thing that I think really, really struck me that is worth mentioning, that with McCartney on the riser, holding his bass up at basically a 45-degree angle, I think that is the archetypal Dirk McQuickley pose.
It really is.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
It is the most perfect example of Dirk McQuickley. Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely.
Right. Ruttles link out of the way, done and dusted. Bingo card tick. Right. Okay. Fantastic. So yeah, we're into the realm of ballads, and ballads often get yeah, a bad name, don't they? I was watching for completer's sake. We're recording this on the 4th of February, which is a Saturday afternoon. Yesterday I was watching, or last night rather, as I think a lot of people do now, watching the reruns of Top of the Pops on BBC Four here in the UK. Sorry, Portugal fans. Um, and there were two episodes, I think, from '94, and the number one in both weeks, consecutive weeks, was Mariah Carey doing "Without You." Because living is without anyway, yeah, and we think of those as being sort of ballady, kind of, big singing, big voice, big emotional statements. But these are much more in keeping with what a lot of people might think are ballads, sort of simple, straightforward declarations of love. Not particularly creating something outrageous, not going for monumental statements in the music, but creating something that's kind of like a beautiful product with instrumentation to go with it. And I think it really works because of that, because of its simplicity. So it's not a power ballad in any way, shape, or form, but you can see the link from this to I mean, Yesterday is one that gets mentioned quite regularly, but also onto some of the later ones. I can see a link between this and Lennon's Julia as well, or even Martha My Dear, and the fact that I'm talking about ballads as being songs that are written about a dog and a mother is a little bit odd, but we'll go with it for the moment. But you can see that this is, and it's one of my expressions. It's a stepping stone from, if you like, Till There Was You towards Yesterday and Michelle, and some of those other ones that end up coming later. And I think it's all the more likable because of that.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. By the way, sorry, before we go on, I'm so glad you said power ballad. I thought you were going to get through that entire description without using the expression
Yeah,
power ballad,
I know.
but you got there in the end. That's fine.
Yeah, I
I mean,
did. Yeah.
we talk about the development of songs and songwriting styles, and particularly sort of during the 50s and 60s, development of rock and roll songs and blues and folk and all this kind of stuff. Oh, and soul as well, of course. But the development of ballads isn't something which much gets talked about, but it is a form which is developmental as well, and it is how you get from a beautiful tender little song like this to Meatloaf or Bonnie Tyler.
Okay, no,
you know
fair enough. I was thinking of, at that point, Jennifer Rush's "The Power of
oh
Love"
yeah,
had,
yeah,
had sprung
another
into my
perfect
head. But
perfect
yeah,
example
Celine
as well.
Dion, all those Diane Warren written songs. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
or anything by Jim Steinman. Yeah, absolutely.
And
But the ballad is a developing form, and this is the form that it developed out of. That's kind of the thing, and it is that very, well, when we talked about Till There Was You and being, just maybe shading towards the twee, and yet one of the great things about this song is that it's not twee
no,
at
it's
all.
not.
It's very, very genuine, and that sincerity is one of the things that makes the song stand out. Like you said, it's not a power ballad. It's not got everything dialed up to 11. It's just a very gentle, very tender, and very sincere little song, and that's precisely why it works.
Yeah, and we've talking in the last episode about "I'm happy just to dance with you," and that very kind of simple expression of pleasure, and then eventually at the end, where George, through the writing of John and or Paul, realizes that he loves her. What was it? What was the word he uses? He
Discovered I'm in love
discovers,
with you. Yes.
discovers. Yeah. Whereas this, there's the rhythm of it is quite constant. There's this, I give her all my love. That's all I do. Blah 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 blah, and I love her. She gives me everything. Blah 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 blah, and I love her. So it's that throughout, that just sort of repetition of it, as emphasizing just how genuine that love is. And yeah, Jane Asher, it's about, apparently it's about Jane Asher. I don't know if it is, but I've read it somewhere. It could well be. It's interesting how McCartney seems to ascribe his differing emotions in some of these songs to his relationship with Jane Asher. Clearly, at this stage, or the stage he wrote this song, everything was going quite well. So, um, very good. The lyrics are not particularly sophisticated, but they work. The whole thing about bright are the stars that shine, dark is the sky. You sort of think, right, okay, we're into twinkle twinkle little star territory here, aren't we? And yet in the song, it works. It just works, and I think it's because he sings it really well, and I can't give it much more of a technical description than that. But he's so clear and purposeful on this that he's almost the. It's quite funny to think of all those times you might have sat with your parents or grandparents watching Christmas Top of the Pops. When I can remember a particular instance where my nan took issue with Shane McGowan. Yeah, I think, right, okay, well, I quite like it actually, but you it's funny to think that there would have been people from an older generation who would have thought, oh, God, these long-haired types, blah blah blah. But then, you hear McCartney sing this, and you think, well, there's not much that anyone could possibly find offensive here, and yet some did. But hey, this is the kind of thing that McCartney goes on to do really, really well. And we're just starting to see him develop his songwriting even further. And yeah, and I couldn't be happier for one.
Well, I'm glad you're happy. It's very much a song which I think captures a mood and the stylistic way. I mean, we talked about this when we talked about the last album and the way that it covers its bases in terms of appealing to different audiences. So you'll have a ballad, you'll have a rock and roll song, you'll have a doo-wop, you'll have, whatever, all these different styles. But there's a coherence to the way that this song is put together that I think, and this album is put together, that I think is lacking in the first two albums. And again, that's not really to be dismissive of them or to slight them in any way, but like you said, it's a developmental thing. It's a progress, or it's progression. That's what you're seeing in this song. It is that progression, and it's one of those songs where I think you really do get the full impact of it by listening to previous recordings, i.e. the one on Anthology particularly, where they have the full band version.
Okay.
Which is really, really interesting because obviously it's demonstrably the same song, but it doesn't have the little ding, 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 ding hook in it. Everything is played electric, and Ringo is on a full kit rather than being on sort of bongos or whatever. And it's a good little song in that version. It doesn't have the middle eight. That hasn't been added at that point. And it's a good little song. But the difference between it being a good little song and this song is vast. And it's just hearing what it came from and listening to then the final version and what it became is, I hesitate to say revelatory, but it kind of is. It's the difference that really taking the time and the care and the concern to understand your own material. That's the kind of difference that this makes. I do love this version very much, but I think my appreciation of it is enhanced even more by hearing the Anthology version. And like a lot of the Anthology versions, it's really interesting to hear them, but often as not, they can simply be like cruder versions of the song that eventually emerges. Whereas here, I think it genuinely opens up the way that songwriting and the way that the recording process has pushed the song to develop.
I have avoided
really,
it.
Really fascinating.
I did read about that, the full band version, but I've avoided listening to it. I will go and give it a go. What's interesting for me is that the fact that, say for example, I'm happy just to dance with you is a few takes and done. And although in fairness, even some of the great songs are a few takes and done, whereas this, there seems to be much more of a developmental process, and that even on a day where they might have done 10, 12, 20 takes, the arrangements apparently developed across those takes
Yeah.
until they found something that worked. And I mean, depending on who you listen to as well, it sounds like George Martin basically said we need an introduction, or Dick James and George Martin might have said we need a middle eight, and then they went away and they wrote it. But actually, in terms of the introduction, you know, going for what McCartney says is quite interesting, because this is, you know, genuinely one of those moments where you think this could be an actual um, realization or an actual memory, as opposed to a slight rewriting. Or because what he actually said was he brought it to the recording session where George Martin listened to it and we were about to record it, and he said, I think it would be good with an introduction. And I swear, right there and then, George Harrison went, well, how about this? And he played the opening riff, which is such a hook. The song is nothing without it. Now, I don't agree. I think there's still enough there without it, but it's really powerful, and it adds something. I mean, we joked in talking about some songs on the first album, how occasionally you'd get the classical guitar out and you'd have like the Spanish waiter syndrome, was the holiday, being on holiday in a restaurant and someone coming around with a classical guitar to try and sort of entertain your evening with a bit of culture. But here, it not only does it really work there through the song, but the end as well, because I think the end of this is such an understated but beautiful thing. It's a subtle finish. It's just perfect. It gets the job done. It kind of repeats the hook of the opening and then stops. You know, everything goes dark, done. And it's beautiful, because you could have come to some sort of climax, or you could have ended up with a fade out or something. You could have gone into later power ballad territory, but they don't. It's so unfussy, it's so unpretentious, that it's just the right thing at the right time. And there's a group collaboration to it that really works. Um, and yeah, the hook, without the hook, it's a different song. But then that's what I mean. It just helps it to make something that's greater than its sort of individual parts.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly why I would encourage you to go and listen to the anthology version, because it doesn't have the hook. And you're right, it's not. I think McCartney's maybe overstating it when he says the song is nothing without it. Maybe he's just being kind to George, I don't know. But it is still a good song without it. But with it, yeah, it just opens up the song in
Yeah.
exactly the way that it needs. And again, George's little solo, the Spanish solo in the middle of it, is just perfect. It's, even although it's just really taking the main line, the melody line of the verses, and recreating it on the classical guitar. It's just exactly what the song needs. It's just lovely. It's such a beautiful little moment.
Yeah.
And you talk about that resolution, the way that it finishes, and it finishes on D, rather than minor, so it resolves it sounds bright, because most of the other stuff it's G minor, it's D minor, B minor, and then it
Yeah.
finishes on this major chord. It finishes in D major, and it's the same thing that Low does on Out of Time, and it's just a little bit like the sun coming out from behind the clouds, and it's a lovely little moment. A Picardy third resolution, apparently, which means nothing to me unless it's, talking about the Star Trek
Oh,
captain.
yeah.
But it's perfect for the song. It's exactly how it should end.
Can I apologise? I almost burst into got part of the way through my O Vienna after you said it means nothing to me. Um, a couple of episodes ago, when we were talking about If I Fell, we had this discussion about how one of the great things about the Beatles is that everything they do is about serving the song, and that's exactly what you're talking about. It's another example where everything they're doing serves the song. It's not at this stage about egos. It's not a hey, let's look really clever by doing this. It's, does it make it a better song? Does it make the boat go faster? Is one of my favorite kind of sort of analogies for that. And it does. All of that just makes it a better song. They could have stuck an up your ass guitar solo in, or some warbling singing, but they don't. It doesn't need it. The song would not be better as a result. and you have to give them absolute credit for being so young and so confident in order to be able to do that. It's a wonderful thing, and it's not a bomb-proof song in any way. It is a I think it's a standard because there are some pretty awful covers by some very good people.
Oh yes.
Which is your favourite bad cover?
Um, Jeez, I think Sarah Vaughan's cover of it is pretty terrible,
Okay,
which is
didn't listen to that one.
which is quite something. I love Sarah Vaughan's voice; she's great, but it's all a bit Shirley Bassey. It doesn't
Right.
really
Okay.
go for that kind. Yeah, it's the whole thing about this song is it's a fragile little thing, and going for bombast kind of swamps that out. It doesn't really come together. Which is
Okay.
yours?
Well, I'm going to mention one that I think will surprise you that I don't think is disastrous. And actually, I'm going to go from my notes here. So I'm just going to read what I put down in my notes.
Okay.
So I put Cliff in 2001 is not disastrous because at least he does something other than make it sound turgid. Brackets, Neil Diamond, I'm looking at you here.
Okay.
If you want turgid, listen to Neil Diamond's cover of
Yeah,
this.
it's really bad.
It's just awful, 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 awful. And the funny thing is, it's in terms of the pace of it, it's not that dissimilar to the kind of the lo-fi recording that Kurt Cobain did at some stage. And yet he brings something to it that gives it depth and meaning. Whereas Neil Diamond just seems to be for the money in terms of that approach.
Yeah. Yeah, the Neil Diamond version is terrible. But we should talk about the Kurt Cobain version a
Yeah,
bit as
do.
well, because it's really interesting. I mean, I'm sure probably everybody knows, but it's on Montage of Heck, home
Sure,
recordings.
everybody knows. Nicely put, sir. Well done. Yeah.
Thank you. Trying not to sound patronising here.
Okay.
But it's a really it's a really interesting version because it is fragile and it is brittle in which is true of the original but in a completely different register, and I think that's one of the reasons his version is incredibly effective because it's giving it a different edge, but it's preserving the thing that makes it special, so it is still this not tender in his version exactly, but it is certainly this very fragile thing, but the fragility is not the fragility of newborn love. In fact, it sounds like the exact opposite. And of course, that's what Kurt Cobain does so well. But it's a really fantastic version. I would love to have heard a more studio based version of it. But if this
Yeah.
is the only one that we have, then that's
Yeah.
more than good enough. Yeah,
You can sort of picture it being on, in preparation for Unplugged in some ways.
definitely.
I don't know anything about the timeline of it in terms of when it was recorded, but it sort of has a feel of something that could maybe thinking, well, shall I do this or shall I do this? No, let's do another Butthole Surfer song. Okay, something that was coming into the conversation about it. But I love the fact that it's such a diverse range of people in a similar time period. You've got Andy Williams and Kurt Cobain. You just think that if this isn't a demonstration of the strength of the song, then nothing is.
Yeah, what range? What range indeed?
Well, not only that, but of course, some of the others that are not mentioned, Roberta Flack, okay, Harry Connick Jr.,
Mm-hmm.
Mary Wilson, who I mentioned in the last episode, doing a sublime cover of Happy Just to Dance with You. Not so good, this one. It's more of a bit of a standard. And I'm sorry, I've really tried not to swear on this, but here's one for you. Howard fucking Jones. Howard Jones. The Howard Jones.
The Howard Jones. Yeah.
It's and that's okay. But we should there's a very culturally significant moment, and I don't know if I've given the example of Brazil and Portugal in terms of the reverse colonialization that's gone on.
Yes.
Have I mentioned
Yeah,
that
you
before?
have. Yeah.
Okay. Well, it applies here because we've got Smokey Robinson covering the Beatles. And you just think, right, we've hit that territory now, isn't it? And I know we've talked before, in a much earlier episode about the album Black Artists. Was it Black Artists Cover the Beatles? I think that's what it was. Anyway, I'll need to look that one up. But you've got people who have inspired the Beatles now covering the Beatles. All you needed really would have been for Elvis to do it, and you'd have had the complete set. The thing about the Smokey Robinson cover is that it's okay, but it's different because what you find is that George's guitar hook has been replaced by some quite powerful strings. So it's got a slightly more menacing feel to the instrumentation, but it's I don't think it's been treated with the reverence that he would have treated one of his own songs.
No, I think that's probably fair. I quite like the Smokey Robinson version. I
Yeah,
wouldn't say it knocks my socks off, but I quite like it. And it is, yeah, just for the cultural sort of cross contamination. It's kind of fascinating to see that sort of taking place. I think the menacing thing that you mentioned, I think that's true. And that's not quite something that this song can support, which I think
no,
is why I think it's fine, but I don't think it's ever any better than that. But it's interesting to hear a different take on it, even if it's not necessarily a successful one.
yeah,
I think it's interesting to hear at least somebody trying to do something different with it. And if it's not a complete success, it's definitely not a complete failure either. And given how many people have covered this song badly, that also counts for something as well.
yeah. No, that's fair. That is absolutely fair.
Bobby Womack.
Oh no, I haven't heard that one. Oh,
Haven't you?
No.
Would
Oh,
recommend.
right. Okay.
It's got a really cheesy kind of voiceover. You have to give love in order to get it back. That's what I've always believed, or words to that effect.
Okay.
It does not enhance the song, I have to say.
Let's not forget, by the way, that in 1991, Mr. P. McCartney is reported to have covered this song as well.
Yes,
So I've
well,
not heard that take on it, but he's a decent bloke. I'm sure he knows what he's doing. Speaking of people who know what they're doing,
segue.
here we go. It's time to link into talking about the film, because without I would say with risk, I am at risk of entering into the realm of hyperbole here. But almost every time we talk about the musical sequence on the film, we're talking about how it just gets better and better and better. And I really liked the sequence for "I'm Happy Just to Dance with You" so much more than I like the song, for example. And yet we then get something that I think is beautiful here, and actually is something that I think a lot of people who direct um, musical sequences could look at. I mean, not that people would make these kind of videos anymore, but there's a lot in it that is incredibly well done and maybe even set a bit of a template. Um, First things first, in "I'm Happy Just to Dance with You," I pointed out, of course, that McCartney's got one leg up. One leg up on the riser, playing his bass. Well, it's George's turn this time. Because he's got his classical guitar in what I've noted down here as being approximately a 30-degree angle, not even a 45-degree. It's going very steeply. I don't know what it is about classical guitar that makes it better to have up there at such a high angle. I don't know, but it reminded me actually to make the reference to last night's Top of the Pops again. They had the wonderful Saint Etienne on with Pale Movie, and of course there's a classical guitar break in that, and again, guitarist behind Sarah Cracknell, same angle. You just think, what is it, dear listener? If you know, last episode we asked you about the older African drums. Well, what is it about the old classical guitar, or as I'm going to call it, the early European guitar? There you go.
As a guitarist, I fear I have no answer to that
No,
question, and I feel I've let the podcast down.
I don't know why, but the setting is kind of finished off by the fact that you've got Ringo at the back behind a drum kit, but with bongos, interestingly, and you've also got three chairs that are kind of the sort that you might see in a psychiatrist's waiting room, and John's sitting on one of them. They look like they're kind of like the slightly leather seats with the metal frame,
Yeah.
and it just seems so odd and so random. But what we get, as we started to get with Happy Just to Dance with You, are shots through the monitor. So, old Dickie Lester's really playing with that idea, and it's so effective. And but you get some beautiful things. Like once George has played his the opening hook, he then obviously stops playing and starts cradling, almost hugging his guitar, which is a beautiful little moment. But we get the camera looking at it as though it's through the monitor, and then it pulls back, and actually what you then get is the bank of monitors in the TV control room. So we've got two of those with the shots of Paul and George next to each other. Then the next one along, we've got a close up of John's face, and the one on the left hand side, we've got Ringo. I mean, it's not clear from that because it's small screen whether he's drumming or whether he's on the bongos at that stage. Turns out he is playing the bongos later in a close up. So you've got all of them. You're looking at them through the monitor screens in the control room as this sort of disembodied hand moves a couple of controls around. And then the camera pans up, and then you can see through the control room window. So not only have you got three of the monitors now, you can't see the one on the right hand side, but you've then got John on the monitor in the studio, but also you can actually see Paul in the distance playing as well. It's just such an. I don't know whether or not anyone at that stage would have managed to get all of them in shots, in different kinds of shots at the same time. And yet you could probably sit down and look at dozens of videos in the later 70s and in the 80s and even into the 90s where people are doing similar things with a split screen effect that surely would have been, inspired from this. I've got more that appeals. I mean, I can talk loads about this, and at some point, maybe I'll just start writing a book about the way in which these were framed. But there's one when Paul starts singing about dark skies. Again, the camera pans left, and you can see his fingers on the fretboard, and it's at roughly a 45-degree angle. But just behind, you've got George's raised fretboard as well, and they're kind of forming a bit of a cross. I'm not trying to engage in any symbolism here about St Andrew, or I don't know. It's like a metaphor for the crucifixion of, or I don't know, whatever. There's nothing like that. It's just actually really interesting, especially because then there's a crossfade to Ringo, and actually the fade starts going through, the cross between the guitars, and it works really well. It's so beautiful. But I just have one complaint. What I want to know is why, for the first half of the guitar solo, Richard Lester focuses on John strumming his guitar, not George playing the actual solo.
Well, I've mentioned this before in the podcast when we've had live recordings of the band playing, and every time George steps up to do his big guitar solo, they immediately whip round to Lennon because apparently that he's not allowed to be on screen doing his solo, and it's kind of interesting to see the same thing happening in the movie as well as the live stuff. So I think the answer to your question is consistent continuity. I think that's probably what it is. But I mean, you're right. This is another absolutely gorgeous sequence in the film. Incredibly self-aware, but without ever becoming sort of tediously meta or whatever. I mean, that wouldn't have been a thing in 1964 in any case. Obviously, that's just how we would interpret it now. But it's self-aware enough to understand that the process of what we are seeing is being presented in a very literal way. There's no attempt to hide the artifice of what's going on. In fact, quite the opposite. That artifice is very, very much being played up. You can't have anything else really with the shots through the control window, the monitors and everything else. But it's not suffocating, and it's just a very interesting interpretation of how to present this song. There are so many ways that you could have had it just very arbitrarily, but you could have had like McCartney on a date with a girl, or you could have had, there are so many other literal ways that you could present this song. and it's not done that way. And obviously, it has to fit within a certain framework of the movie. But as we've discussed before, the sequences don't need to literally be part of the plot. They will just stop so that we can have like an interesting music video, and then we'll get back to the action, if that's the word. And the song doesn't do that. The sequence doesn't do that. It holds its place, and it's again that I think one of the reasons it works is because the self awareness of the video matches the self awareness of the song. If that's not, because there is something very, even although it's a very simple lyric, there is something very it feels personal, whether it's about Jane Asher or whoever it is. That doesn't really matter, but it still feels like it's a really kind of personal little moment. And I think that the way that the cameras kind of almost intrude into the production of the song kind of gives that sense of intimacy. Maybe that's the word I'm looking for. It gives that closeness to it, and I think that's one of the reasons that sequence is so effective.
Yeah, I mean, I've been looking at sort of delving in and reading a few more Beatles books, and I was just wondering if there was a book about it. There must be a book about the Beatles films, but I think it's worth reading about this to actually sort of find out whether or not there was any intentions. I will actually do some research on this because obviously we're going to be with this album for a little while yet, and then we are going to talk about the film. Well, not only will we talk about the album, but we'll talk about the film as well. So there's still some way to go on this. So, but I think it would be interesting to know just how much of this was intentional. But even if it wasn't, I think it's just so incredibly effective. I mean, yeah, I was having a flick through the Norman Hunter book today. No, it's not Norman Hunter, is it? Norman Hunter played for Leeds. Who am I thinking of?
Hunter Davis.
Hunter Davis, thank you. Yeah. Right, okay. I nearly went on to Ian Hunter, but that would have been anyway. Never mind.
Okay, yeah,
and
we
then
got
it would have
there.
been Ian Huntley, and then that's something very different indeed. Yeah, I was having a look through that earlier today, and it really surprised me because there's a lot of stuff up and before '63, and then there's a bunch of stuff after '68. But actually, the it sort of seems to skirt through the whole Beatlemania thing really quickly. So that was a little bit disappointing. But I'll have another kind of trawl back through some of those books to see what I can find. Yeah, so it's just to add that little bit of credibility, because of course we've got none. Hi, folks.
Well, we'll look
Yeah.
forward to your research based updates in later episodes then.
Well, it's a funny thing because I mean I've been a Beatles fan for a long time, but of course there've been long periods when I've not really listened to that much Beatles music. But then setting this as a kind of a challenge, it's not like a if you start studying something, sometimes you can then kind of fall out of love with it. Actually, it's kind of deepened my regard for it and made me want to find out more, which is why, dear listener, if you've stuck with this from episode one and through, you'd find that perhaps for the last 10 or so episodes, I've been doing a lot more research rather than just making sort of quippy little comments in the background. I actually got a lot more stuff to contribute to it. So as we're developing, so I want to then develop and improve that knowledge. And by the time this comes out, you might even find that we've got other sort of things that we're going to start pinging up. We're kind of talking about a blog, for example, at the moment as well. So it may well be that that's up and running by the time this episode comes out, probably in March, I would have thought. So bearing all of that in mind, where are we on the JG McQuarrie-ometer in terms of the ratings, the completely spurious ratings?
Spurious ratings ahoy! I think probably I'm hovering a little bit between 7.5 and 8.
Ooh, okay.
Yeah,
So
I do.
eight. You've given things like to please please me, and 7.5 money, 7.5 from me to you, boys and ask me why ha 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 hi. You've not given many eights, interestingly.
No, I'm a bit. I
Are
don't
you
know.
saying it's as good as From Me to You, or better than?
Oh, I've really. They should. I shouldn't have to. I shouldn't have to think this hard about it. You know what? I'm
Okay,
going to go with. I'm going to go with 7.5.
okay.
I'm going to go with 7.5. I think that's. I think that's fair.
So
Yeah.
I've given seven to things like All I've Got to Do, and Money, and Hard Day's Night. And I think there's some sort of parity with that in terms of my emotional response to it. Whereas at eight, I've given it to things like She Loves You and All My Loving, and You've Really Got a Hold of Me, and those give me a much greater emotional response than this. As much as I like this, for me, it's a seven. It's sort of what we've had so far. It's definitely one of the strongest. Um, but remember, there's still we've still got yesterday, and if you're going to give eight to this, that means you're automatically going higher with yesterday, aren't you? Or are you? Save that for a later date. Ooh, controversial.
Well, we'll find out when we get there.
In
Sometime in 20.
2027.
Exactly. Whenever we finally manage to slog our way through to hell.
Yeah.
Okay,
So
perhaps so seven then.
maybe then it's time just to move on to our brand new section, which of course is called something along the lines of "You Can Really Get a Hold of Me."
Yes, you can really get a hold of us by inserting a cheesy segment at the end of your podcast, which we mean you can email us on BeatlesStuffology@gmail.com. We're on Twitter at Beatles_ology, and you can find more of my writing at www.jgmcquarrie.scot. Also, please check out my other podcast, Talking Trek to You, where a noob and an expert, me apparently, go through the original Star Trek episode by episode. Please like, rate, and review us on whatever podcatcher you're using so that more people can find the show. Next week, we have Tell Me Why. But until then, keep listening.